was 17, I ran away from home and from everything I had ever known. I was sick and tired, living in a town filled with narrow minds and hate. They used to laugh at me, their children called me names. I would run and hide, feeling so ashamed just for being born. I was just a boy, punished for a crime that was not mine. Life ain't so easy when you're a gay.
Hello, 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 and thank you so much for tuning in to A Spoonful of Comfort. I am Claudrine Jackson, your host for A Spoonful of Comfort, reminding you and me that we are not a part of the discomfort in the world, and we know there's a lot of discomfort going on. We are not a part of the discomfort in the world. We are part of the comfort. So thank you so much for tuning in. I'm honored for the privilege of your time. You know, I do a lot of things because of my son who is handicapped by autism, and we have the Purvis Jackson Autism Foundation. And I thank you, donors to the Purvis Jackson Foundation. People have donated anonymously by way of Facebook. So I don't know who you are, but I thank you, I appreciate you, and you are helping me help handicapped children. So I have a very special guest today, a very interesting person that I would love for you to meet. He is the author of the books that you see here, the Burwood Wall. And I have lived in Detroit many years, but reading his history about the Burwood Wall, I learned so much about Detroit. So his book is full of facts and information about obstacles that Black people had to overcome to get where we are in the present day. The book is comprehensive and thorough and extremely interesting. I want to introduce you to Gerald Van Dusen.
Thank you, Claudrine. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you this morning.
So would you tell us how you came about writing tell us about the Burwood Wall first.
Sure. I learned of the Burwood Wall when I was 16 years old. This was back, I hate to say it, 1962. I was a high school student at U of D Jesuit High School on 7 Mile and Cherry Lawn. Actually, I was raised on the far west side. I grew up in the 6 Mile Telegraph area, but I commuted to high school at 7 Mile and Cherry Lawn, and during my sophomore year, one of my classmates and I were preparing for our quarterly exams, and he was really good in mathematics, and I was really good in languages. So I helped him with his Latin. He helped me. He helped with geometry. After we studied for a while, we walked the neighborhood. He lived on Pinehurst, which was a couple of blocks from the wall. So we walked the neighborhood, and we came across this rather tall, thick concrete wall, and I said, "What is this thing?" And he says, "Well, to initiate you into the neighborhood, what you have to do is what I had to do. Climb the wall, and we'll walk it as far as you can." So we were about 8 Mile Road, and we started walking south to Norfolk, which was the first cross street. I didn't make it. I tripped and fell off the wall, tripped over a tree branch, because at that time, since the wall was already 20-some years old, a lot of shrubs and trees had grown, and there was outbuildings and the like in the backyard. So when I picked myself up, dusted myself off, I said, "This is crazy. Why would anyone build a concrete wall when you could have put up a fence, a normal wire fence?" And he said, and I'll never forget the expression on his face, because his face kind of dropped. He said, and the only words I remember from the day at the time. The wall was built to keep people like you away from people like me. And the issue of race had never really come up in our relationship before. We were just classmates struggling to get through Latin and geometry and history, etc. We were more concerned about what we were going to do over the weekend. And here we were, suddenly confronted by this awful segregation wall in a moment of self-awareness that I had never, thought about in my life before.
Well, I thank you so much for sharing with us that story and sharing with us the impact that the wall had on you. Can you tell us where the wall is located?
Sure. If you travel down 8 Mile, heading in an easterly direction from, say, Southfield, if that's where you're coming from, you would continue on 8 Mile before you get to Wyoming. Before you get to Wyoming, you'll see a street called Burwood. And I would suggest you take the next block east, which is Griggs, and turn right and drive about 2 blocks. And there you'll see a park. And it's the Alfonso Wells Park. And I say go that way because you want to see the wall. Most of the wall is kind of buried in shrubbery and trees and backyards, but there's one large expanse of the wall at the Alfonso Wells Park, which is best approached at the park through Griggs Street. So you can certainly go to Burwood, but it'll dead end and you'll have to stop the car and get out and walk into the park that way. But either way, you'll see about 100 yards of the wall exposed with murals that were painted about 10 years ago, depicting civil rights history and the like. But the wall extends left and right, north and south, well beyond what you see there at the park.
And according to Mr. Van Dusen's book, the wall was built in 1941 because there was a developer who wanted to build homes in the area, and he could not get a loan from the federal government because they were afraid of racial tensions. So his way of getting a loan from the federal government was to build that wall to separate black people from white people. And I've driven past the wall, I've seen it, but it never dawned on me what it was, because they have painted it and they've done so much to make it look better,
Right.
that I had no idea of the origins of that wall.
Well, the funny thing is, when I began to research it and walk the neighborhood and talk to people whose houses abut the wall, I asked them what they knew of it, and I'd say maybe 20% of the people knew the origin of the wall, but even then it was kind of a sketchy piece of information. And I think if you look up the Burwood Wall on the internet, you'll learn the story of why it was constructed, but you won't learn about the community itself that was isolated from the prospective white community on the other side of the wall. And that's why I wrote the book, because no one really talked about the people themselves who were affected by the wall being constructed.
So in your book, which is so comprehensive and thorough, some of the things that really impressed me about the book, because the book is far more comprehensive than the wall. It's named the Burwood Wall, and that was the focus, but there's so much more in the book other than about the Burwood Wall. Mr. Van Dusen talks about how blacks were treated when they came from the South to get jobs in the automobile plants, and how they were treated for homes. You explained redlining in your book, that in the desirable areas were one color, but then the worst areas were red. And then that's how redlining,
Exactly.
the term redlining came about.
The term redlining didn't really appear until probably the 1960s, around the time of open housing. But redlining, in effect, took place beginning in the 40s. But really, if you want to understand the whole history of segregation, you have to go back to the beginning of the Great Migration, because prior to 1910, which is the time where most historians locate the beginning of the migration north.
Right.
And when you talk the migration, you're talking not just African Americans, but Southern whites who wanted to escape the South because the jobs were few.
Right.
So there was a great exodus from the South of whites and blacks to northern cities where hopefully jobs could be found, homes could be built, and lives could be lived in a much happier way than the way life was in the South after Reconstruction. So what I learned was that during the Great Migration, whites who were here, and again, the focus is on Detroit, not Chicago or Pittsburgh, which had similar situations, but in Detroit, a lot of the whites were fearing this exodus of Southern people who spoke differently, acted differently, and talked differently, white and black, and they feared for their property, feared for property values, feared for all kinds of crazy things. And so, beginning in about 1910, there was the practice of putting in the deeds of property exchanges what were called racially restrictive covenants, an agreement that when the house goes up for sale, the sale will be limited to people of whatever those selling the house want to limit it to. And in many cases, it was of ethnic origin. So whites would only want to sell to whites, and they would create a clause in the deed saying that this property can only pass to whites. And it wasn't until much later, 1948, that the Supreme Court ruled that that was unenforceable. But my point is that in Detroit, outside of the downtown area, the inner circle of like Black Bottom, 80% of Detroit, the deeds contained these racially restrictive covenants, which prohibited blacks from buying property. So they could only purchase property or rent in apartment buildings that, again, were owned by landlords that were governed by these deeds in certain areas that did not have these restrictive covenants. And so what I learned was that there were only a half a dozen places in the city where blacks could live, could move. And since the population of Detroit doubled, black population doubled from 1940, when it was 150,000, to 300,000 in 1950, where do these people go? It creates not just a segregated situation, it creates an overcrowded situation, which creates additional tension. And we saw how that affected people in 1967, the overcrowding and the
Well, you
rebellion.
even mentioned that in 43, but we'll talk about that. But one of the things that Mr. Van Dusen brought out in his book that really impressed me was that when African Americans came to work in the plants, they were given the hottest, dirtiest jobs. That black people were only supposed to work as janitors or porters or elevator operators, that we were not able to work in the industry. So that was interesting to see him bring that out. And that my mother told me a story about, she was working at one of the plants. And she said she was working during the war when they were making war parts. And they took her into a different part of the plant where it was real hot, and there were only black people there. And they told her, you're going to work in this area, and they referred to it as the jungle.
Is that right?
Yes. So she experienced what you talked about in the book. So the fact that you are so thorough and that you covered so much of the happenings. Now, I don't want to forget about Royal Oak. Will you tell
That's
us
right.
about Royal Oak?
Well, again, for me, it was a learning experience. I thought that the wall was built to separate the people living east of the wall, the black community east of the wall, Detroiters, south of 8 Mile. Turns out that the community that went back to the early 1920s was not only the Detroit side of 8 Mile, but also the Oakland County side of 8 Mile, which today is incorporated as the Charter Township of Royal Oak. It was one unified square mile community, and black businesses thrived along 8 Mile, and people who lived in that area were, in many instances, reluctant to travel too far out because of the discrimination that existed. So businesses popped up of all kinds that fulfilled all of the needs of that particular community. Eventually, the section of Detroit south of 8 Mile was annexed by the city. I believe it was in 1926. So schools were built and water came, that area was electrified, and 8 Mile was widened, businesses were knocked down, and so there were barriers now created between Royal Oak Township and Detroit. But you have to remember, back in the 20s, it was one big family of African Americans living in that square mile, and it didn't matter that 8 Mile separated them. In fact, 8 Mile was a unifier because of the businesses that existed along the roadway that separated the two parts of the community. But I've met more people who had family members north of 8 Mile and people in Royal Oak that had family members south, and they would go back and forth to aunts and uncles, parents and children, and so there's really a very tight bond between the communities that still exists today.
And the book is full of pictures. If you get the book, you'll see a lot of pictures of the history. And some of the churches and the schools that he has pictures of are still here, like Mount Beulah Church,
right,
and Oak Grove Church. So if you get a copy of the book, you'll be able to see a lot of the historical pictures. He mentions Grant School and Carver School in the segregation, and those are the two schools that my husband attended. He mentioned more schools,
right,
but Grant and Carver,
right,
are the ones. So do you remember what you said about either one of those schools?
Well, Carver Elementary supported families that lived immediately to the west of Wyoming. And if you went to Grant School, it was because you lived to the east of Wyoming. And after you graduated from Carver, there was no high school in the immediate area that would take you. Oak Park wasn't interested. So the Carver students wound up going to Northern High School in Detroit by virtue of an agreement between the Detroit Public School System and Royal Oak. And then Grant students stayed in the community, went slightly north to Ferndale, and went to Ferndale High School, and experienced all kinds of discrimination. I talked to a number of graduates of Grant who went to Ferndale, and they weren't even allowed to use the swimming pool. They were deliberately put into classes that restricted their movement, restricted their participation in certain activities, including swimming classes and the like. There was a ice cream store across from Ferndale High, and a couple of the people that I talked to recalled walking across the street early in the fall, going to get ice cream and being told at the door, "No blacks allowed." These were young high school kids being told that. So they'd have to go down to the 5 and 10 in downtown Ferndale to get an ice cream. I mean, bizarre. I mean, stories that you just can't make up that were much of the fabric of their daily lives.
And I'm so glad that as an African American that you were so sensitive to our plight and that the obstacles that we had to overcome. So I thank you for this book. And we're going to talk about another project that you're working on. But first, I want you to tell us about one of our presidential candidates at the Wall.
Back in early July, Elizabeth Warren came to the Wall to discuss her housing program, where she elected president. And so the Detroit News, coincidentally, was running a story on the Wall because the Councilman McAllister and others had applied for and received a $40,000 national park grants to research more of the area. And so my book was published at the time the grant was awarded, and at the time Elizabeth Warren visits the Wall. So it all comes together. And so the Detroit News in July 6th, I think, runs a front page story with the Wall on the big picture of the Wall, and talks about Elizabeth Warren and the grant and my book. And so it's a good time in Detroit history to remind ourselves where we've been, possibly to look forward to where we're going, and use the Wall as a symbol of what once was, and how we have to be mindful of history, because as one great historian said, those that don't read history, don't learn of history, are condemned to repeat it. And
Exactly.
I think that's one of the lessons of the book, I believe.
Could you tell us, has anybody ever tried to tear the Wall down, or?
Back in, I'm guessing about 20 years ago, this is only word of mouth,
Right.
but Alfonso Wells, the man after whom Alfonso Wells Park off of Grigg Street is named, who was a local political activist
Right.
and community organizer, he called the building department, and really out of, I suppose, a sense of embarrassment, because he knew what the Wall was for, and it was just a living, breathing reminder of a time which he felt was a point of humiliation, of embarrassment. And so he asked the building department, don't you think it's about time that we'd leveled the Wall and put that deep into the past? And the building department said, we're not going to go to the expense of knocking the Wall down, but if you want to knock it down, it's in the easement between the neighborhoods, you go right ahead. Well, it didn't happen. Alfonso Wells did not organize an effort to knock the Wall down.
Well, because the Wall was so tall, it's 6 feet high and 1 foot,
foot thick.
So that would be quite an undertaking.
And it runs 3 city blocks,
Right.
all the way to Pembroke,
So that would be quite an undertaking to try to knock it down.
and to remove it.
Right. But the parts that I've seen, they've put murals on
That's right.
it. So is the whole Wall, you said some parts are covered by
Trees and bushes.
Yes, yes.
If you want to see it, you really have to visit Alfonso Wells Park. That's the only place where, as I say, about 100 to 200 yards are fully exposed in the park with the murals on them. And you can walk up, climb the Wall, touch the Wall, take pictures by the Wall. It's an artifact that I think it's important that we keep, maintain, and there's going to be an historical
Right.
marker placed there so that it will never be torn down.
Right. And as Mr. Van Dusen said, a lot of people in the neighborhood didn't even know the story of the Wall. I didn't. And I was surprised when I heard why the Wall was there. It surprised me.
People move in, people move out,
Yeah.
and never even question
Right.
the origins.
But before we run out of time, would you tell us how we can get the book?
Sure. The simplest way would be to go to the book's website, which is burwoodwall.com. BIRWOODWALL.com. burwoodwall.com. There's a list of booksellers. You can click on a link. You can go to the publisher itself, Arcadia Publishing. You can go to walmart.com, target.com. Amazon sells it. And any bookstore will order it for you.
Well, thank you. And tell us what, do you have any other projects that you're working on?
Well, I hint at it in the book because a few miles away from the Wall, there is the Sojourner Truth Housing Project
Yes.
that in 1942 was built to accommodate defense workers, particularly African American defense workers. And given its location, a lot of neighbors were concerned about it becoming a temporary barracks and possibly drawing the wrong element, as was suggested by some of the local residents. So it became a bone of contention, and a riot occurred in which locals picketed and tried to prevent occupation by black renters, defense workers. And the whole story of that sad chapter in American Detroit history will be retold in my next chapter, my next book, in another year.
Like I said, there's so much history in the book that we can't possibly cover all of it. Mr. Van Dusen talks about the race riot in 1943. He mentioned Sojourner Truth. There were white people picketing to keep black people from being able to live there. And wasn't that the cause of another riot?
Well, there's the 42 riot,
Okay.
and then, of course, the 67 riot.
Right.
One of the areas that I think needs to be explored, if you're going to understand why these events occurred, are these segregated neighborhoods. And what I'd like to see written, or what I'd like to write, are Detroit's historic African American neighborhoods. Because if you understand the neighborhoods, and they include Black Bottom, they include Paradise Valley, what's called North End, Conant Gardens, the 7 Mile, Wyoming, the Wall area,
Right.
and West Side. There's half a dozen areas that thrived during the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s that we've kind of forgotten about.
Well, I will be looking forward to your next book. We are running out of time. His books are so comprehensive. This is Gerald Van Dusen, author of The Burwood Wall. Thank you so much for tuning in to A Spoonful of Comfort. I look forward to seeing you next Tuesday at 1:30 right here on WHPR TV.
When I was 17, I ran away from home and from everything I had ever known. I was sick and tired, living in a town filled with narrow minds and hate. They used to laugh at me, their children called me names. I would run and hide, feeling so ashamed just for being born. I was just a boy.